Order, order. Daniel Kawczynski to move the motion.
For Polish contribution during the Second World War, Mr. Pritchard, and it's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of the summer of 1939 was designed to annihilate and destroy Poland and the Polish nation.
Order. Sorry, Mr. Kawczynski, can I just encourage the public gallery not to take photographs? It is not permitted in Westminster Hall. Thank you. Daniel Kawczynski.
Thank you, Mr. Pritchard. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, as I said, was designed to destroy and annihilate the Poles. And a few weeks later, after this treaty between the Germans and Russians was signed, we saw the brutal invasion of Poland by German forces on September the 1st, 1939. Despite so much subjugation, despite the fact of so many Polish cities being destroyed and so many Poles being imprisoned, and the tyranny of what was imposed on Poland in 1939 and thereafter, Poles themselves refused to be subjugated. They share our values of freedom and determined to be free people. They came in unprecedented numbers from Poland to join up with British forces to fight with their British counterparts in 1939 and 1940. And of course, the Polish government in exile came to be based here in London, and thanks to the hospitality and generosity of the British government, the Polish government in exile actually operated in London until 1989, with the fall of communism in Poland, and when a democratic and legitimate government was finally restored to Poland. And of course, the most important battle that they participated in was the Battle of Britain itself. And today I had the great honour of speaking again to Lord Tebbit in the other house about his views about the Battle of Britain. And one of the most enjoyable things that I've done in the last 14 years as a Member of Parliament was to join Lord Tebbit at the RAF Club for an Anglo-Polish dinner, where Lord Tebbit was the guest speaker. And he said something which has really resonated with me and which I will always remember, and I wanted to share with you today. According to Lord Tebbit, the Royal Air Force and the Luftwaffe were so evenly matched in the summer of 1940 that the British side was beginning to lose that battle. Those are the words of Lord Tebbit, not my own. So evenly matched were they. And in fact, what he said is that to replace the planes was relatively easy. Carry on production with armaments factories and creating these planes was fine. But to replace the pilots was extremely difficult. We all know how long it takes to train a pilot, and it was very difficult to replace all the losses. And according to Lord Tebbit, it was the Poles coming in such unprecedented numbers to join the British forces in the summer of 1940 that tipped the balance to the British side. And I have to say that last year there were two wonderful films that were released here in the United Kingdom. One of them is called the Hurricane Movie. The other one is called the 303 Squadron. And I've spoken about these films to colleagues who have then gone on to watch these films. And I very much urge you, Mr. Pritchard, as my Shropshire neighbour, if you have the opportunity of watching one of these films. But of course, it's a modern-day account sharing with the next generation and new, younger generations about the extraordinary heroism, courage, and determination of these Polish pilots to fight in the Battle of Britain. And of course, the Polish 303 Squadron shot down more enemy aircraft than any other squadron in the Battle of Britain. It is the most famous squadron, but it was one of 16 Polish squadrons embedded within the RAF. And we talk about Poles coming to this country. Of course, there are now 1 million Poles in the United Kingdom, and we benefit enormously from their contribution to our country. I have heard in the past people talking about Poles coming to live and work here and us being so dependent on Polish plumbers and other Polish professions, but we were so dependent on these Poles, these highly skilled, brave, courageous Poles when they came. And just as an example of that, I met with the new editor of the Shrewsbury Chronicle, which you will know, Mr. Pritchard, is the main newspaper in my constituency. And Mr. Burakowski, the editor of the Shrewsbury Chronicle, when I met him last week, was telling me about his father's experiences. He was one of those Poles who had come over during the Second World War and was part of a bombing squadron. The Poles were also led out of captivity in the Soviet Union by the famous General Anders. We have invited his daughter, Senator Anna Maria Anders, on many occasions to address the Polish diaspora here in the House of Commons. But General Anders brought many Polish soldiers from captivity in the Soviet Union through Iran and joined up with the British forces in Palestine, where they were equipped and trained before they joined the British 8th Army. I've had the opportunity of visiting British and Polish graves in Libya before the revolution and seeing these cemeteries side by side in Tripoli, but also in Tobruk. And what was so poignant for me when I visited these cemeteries is just how young these boys were. In certain cases, 19, 20, 21. They were fighting side by side, British and Poles, in the desert, in Libya, hundreds of miles from their homes, in a desert terrain, so young, so much ahead of them, the opportunity to have children perhaps one day themselves, the opportunity to have a full and successful life, and yet at the age of 19 or 20, they gave up their lives together, sacrificed their lives in order to fight fascism and the tyranny of fascism. That's why we remember them today, and that's why we remember their sacrifices. Yes, of course.
Thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. We have a Polish community in Coventry, but I hope the honourable gentleman will talk about Polish heroism at Monte Cassino, for example, because that was quite a battle, and the casualties were very high amongst Polish troops.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman, and I will come on to the Monte Cassino shortly. But talking about North Africa, I have to say that anybody, Mr. Pritchard, who has studied the Battle of El Alamein, which, as you will know, was the turning point in the whole North African campaign, anybody who has studied maps of El Alamein, that battlefront, and the topography of the terrain of El Alamein, will realize the extraordinary importance that landmines played in that operation. And I have to say to you, it was a Pole, Joseph Kosacki, who invented the mine detector. And that mine detector was used successfully for the first time in 1941 in El Alamein, which of course was, as I've said, the turning point in the North African campaign. Can you imagine, Mr. Pritchard, if we had lost in Alamein? And can you imagine, and the forces between the Allies and the Axis powers were very finely balanced at that juncture in 1941. Can you imagine if we had lost and if Rommel's forces had managed to push forward beyond Egypt to take the oil fields of the Middle East? Again, I think the events unfolding in the Second World War may have been very, very different. So we celebrate the contribution of Joseph Kosacki, a great Pole who died in 1990 for his contribution in inventing the mine detector. The honourable gentleman referred to Monte Cassino, and once the Polish and British forces had gone through from El Alamein, through Tobruk, retaken Benghazi and Tripoli, through Tunisia, they came up through Sicily and the spine of Italy, finally reaching the Gustav Line. And the Gustav Line was the strongest fortified, highly elevated defences along the spine of Italy, which were perceived to be impregnable. And the most difficult part of the Gustav Line was Monte Cassino itself. On the 18th of May, 1944, at 9:45 a.m., a patrol of the 12th Podolski Lancers Regiment reached the ruins of Monte Cassino, and they put there a Polish flag, followed very shortly by a British flag. I watched today, it's very easy to talk about some of these sacrifices and statistics, Mr. Pritchard, but today in my House of Commons office I watched a YouTube video of the battle in Monte Cassino, the hand-to-hand combat, throwing grenades at each other and being fired upon all the time. It was perceived to be one of the most bloodiest and difficult battles on the whole of the Western Front during the Second World War. And just during Monte Cassino, the Poles lost 923 men died, 2,931 were injured, and 345 were reported missing. It is in the lexicon of the whole of the Polish narrative. Monte Cassino is something that all Poles have very close to their heart. And I better stop talking about it, otherwise I'll start to well up. But a song was created which is called The Red Poppies on Monte Cassino to symbolize the extraordinary amount of blood that was spilt by Polish soldiers in reaching the top in order to liberate it. Of course, we are not allowed to speak in foreign languages, Mr. Pritchard, but it's called Czerwone Maki na Monte Cassino, which translates as the red poppies on Monte Cassino. Yes, I give way.
I'm most grateful to my honourable friend and neighbour for giving way and for his wonderful speech. I wonder if he's also had the opportunity to visit the National Memorial Arboretum in my own county of Staffordshire, where a statue of a Polish soldier from Monte Cassino is there, along with 3 other statues of Polish servicemen. This was unveiled about 10 years ago in a fitting memorial to the huge contribution made by Polish forces during the Second World War.
Well, I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend and near neighbour for raising that. Of course, and having these Westminster Hall debates, as we are doing now, throws up all of this very interesting information about the Arboretum in his constituency, and I very much hope that encourage members of the public who are watching this on television throughout our country to actually take advantage of coming to his constituency or nearby in Lichfield to look at this wonderful Arboretum and memorial. General Anders, who led the Polish forces in Monte Cassino, said this: 22 days under constant fire in terrible conditions, 7 days of fierce struggle to break German defences. It was not just a battle of Cassino, it was the battle for Poland. And that was from his book, Without Last Chapter. We recently saw on television the commemoration of the D-Day landings, Mr. Pritchard, and our own Prime Minister joined Mr. Morawiecki, the Polish Prime Minister, on the 75th anniversary of those important landings, D-Day, 1944, of course, the start of the liberation of the whole of the continent of Europe. And again, the Poles, the month before just recently, fighting in Monte Cassino, were also there at D-Day. Polish airmen took part in protecting the convoys of soldiers that were moving towards Normandy, and Polish ships took part in Operation Neptune, the naval operation, which was part of the D-Day landings. The Polish 1st Armoured Division, attached to the British and Canadian forces, landed later in the campaign and took part in fighting around the Falaise pocket. Of course.
I thank him for giving way. Would he add to that list of Polish contributions to the Second World War 3 mathematicians whose work helped to make Enigma possible, which ended the war at least 2 years earlier?
Yes. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and I have a little section on that a little bit later on in my speech. Finally, Operation Market Garden, where the Allies tried to shorten the war by landing in the Netherlands. Polish paratroopers took part in unprecedented numbers with their British counterparts in Operation Market Garden. And again, I have had the opportunity of visiting the Polish and British cemeteries in the Netherlands, and of course we see the same recurring theme. It is the sheer youth of these young men who together gave up their lives so that we can have freedom. My honourable friend has mentioned Bletchley Park, and of course he is absolutely right. Polish mathematicians and code breakers came over from Poland, and Sir Dermot Turing, relative of Alan Turing, in his book, The Real Story of How Enigma Was Broken, has highlighted the unique contribution, the outstanding and overwhelming contribution of Polish mathematicians and cryptographers that broke those Enigma codes. And I can't begin to explain the importance of this, as my honourable friend has already alluded to. By breaking the codes, giving us the opportunity of understanding where German positions and movements were going to be forthcoming, allowed us to shorten the war, some say by at least 2 years, therefore potentially saving hundreds of thousands, if not perhaps millions of lives. But there are 3 gentlemen who I'd like to refer to put on the record. Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Rozycki, and Henryk Żygalski. And somebody who was originally born in Poland, even I have difficulty pronouncing those surnames, and I dread to think what the people in Hansard are going to do with them, but I hope I pronounce them correctly. Mr. Pritchard, we also had recently, we have donated books for the House of Commons Library, and there's been an exhibition here in the House of Commons just 2 weeks ago about a lady called Krystyna Skarbek, or Granville. She was apparently, according to legend, Winston Churchill's favourite spy. And she was a young Polish lady who was dropped behind enemy lines on many occasions and very instrumental in reconnaissance and helping to ensure that sabotage against German forces was coordinated in an effective way. Despite all of those contributions, and I think my honourable friends and honourable members will acknowledge that Poland made those extraordinary contributions, the Clement Attlee government refused to allow Polish soldiers to take part in the victory parade on the 8th of June 1946 for fear of offending Joseph Stalin. This dictator had already by that stage managed to impose a brutal, tyrannical communist puppet regime in Poland, but for fear of upsetting him, we in this country decided to exclude the Polish forces from that victory parade on the 8th of June 1946. I give way.
Giving way and congratulate him on securing the debate and the tremendous speech that he's giving. And in Suffolk, we're aware of the contribution that the Polish Air Force made to supporting the war effort from Norfolk and Suffolk during the war. But on that point, I mean, he makes a very good point about the failure of the Attlee government to recognise the contribution of the Polish community in the Polish Army and Air Force in the war. How would he suggest, as we come to 75 years on from VE Day next year, we could help to put right that wrong and to better recognise the Polish contribution to the war effort?
Well, I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend for raising that point, and I want to take the opportunity of saying that, you know, as a fluent Polish speaker, well, or attempting to be fluent, very difficult language, I have to say, when you go to Poland and you speak to them in English, they say something quite different to you than when you go and talk to them in Polish. And this is still a real... They're very friendly towards the British, they love the British, they want to work with the British, but this is still a source of real pain for the Poles. And I think that he's touching upon a very, very important issue. How do we now repair what happened in 1946? And how do we work with the Polish diaspora here in the United Kingdom to ensure that the Polish community themselves, that we engage with the Polish diaspora here in our country to make sure that we do create a new monument or do something to ensure that that unique contribution is highlighted. We have a Polish war memorial in Northolt, but can we do something in addition to that, in the run-up to many anniversaries, to yet again celebrate the contribution of Poles and educate the younger generations about their unique contribution? I give way, of course, to my fellow half Pole from the Labour Party.
I say dziękuję for giving way to me. And as the honourable gentleman knows, my paternal grandfather was Polish. He served in the Polish Merchant Navy, and that is what actually brought him here to the UK. And I'd love to work with him on creating a lasting memorial to all those Poles who contributed so much. And the final thing I'd like to say is my grandfather, Mieczysław Bagnicki, he was Polish to his fingertips, and he was very proud of that. But equally, he thought the UK had given him a wonderful life. He brought his children up here, it gave him a career, and he was incredibly grateful for everything that Britain and the Queen had done for him. And so I think the concept of a lasting memorial would be very appropriate indeed. And I thank him for that.
He gave us you.
Well, I'd like to thank the Honourable Lady for that contribution, and what I would say to her is we Poles have to stick together. And I would be delighted to work with her and anybody else who is cognizant of the unique contribution of Poles to our country and also wants to demonstrate to the 1 million Poles living in the United Kingdom that we value them today, that we cherish their contribution to our country, and that we are determined to work together to remember these things, even in the modern age. We may be leaving the European Union, but we're not leaving Europe. And it's very, very important to remember that Poland will continue to be a very important ally for us in NATO. I'm coming up to wrapping up, Mr. Pritchard, but I'd like to say one thing. And I gave a book to the... Of course I give way.
He's done an excellent job in detailing the contribution made across the services, of course, every year of the war. And I think that's right, and that often isn't appreciated. It certainly is appreciated in my constituency, which, of course, houses the Polish social and cultural organisation, the POSC, to which all members are very welcome. But I thought he was a little bit sectarian in talking about the Attlee government. I'm sure he would also like to pay tribute to that government for passing the Polish Resettlement Act in 1947, which was effectively the first mass migration act and enabling citizenship for about 200,000 Poles who'd fought in that wartime generation.
Yes, I very much acknowledge that, and I can assure the honourable gentleman I wasn't trying to make a party political point on that, I deliberately didn't say Labour government, I said the Attlee government, but I acknowledge his point about some of the subsequent achievements of that government in protecting the rights of the Polish people to remain and settle here in the United Kingdom. The first thing I gave to Jonathan Nott, the current British ambassador to Warsaw, when he came to visit us, was a copy of a book outlining Operation Unthinkable. These were Churchill's plans, basically the unthinkable, which was to carry on and liberate, go beyond Berlin and to liberate Warsaw. Of course, we had declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939 because of our treaty obligations to Poland. The Poles were sad and concerned that a second front against Germany was not possible in 1939, early 1940, by the French and the British. And of course, the Poles at that juncture were left to defend themselves. On one side fighting the Germans, on the other side fighting the Russians. But Churchill, towards the end of the war, wanted to promote these plans to liberate Warsaw, but unfortunately those plans were thwarted by Roosevelt and Stalin and others. And Poland was then subjugated to 50 years of brutal, tyrannical communist regime. And I believe I'm the only Conservative MP who was born in a communist country. So I know what communism is. I know how it looks like and how it feels like. I used to go back to see my beloved grandfather, Daniel Kawczynski, every year under communism, and what our fellow Europeans went through being subjugated to this politically Orwellian and economically illiterate system is beyond comprehension. And that is one of the reasons why they have needed help in the post-communist era to rebuild their country and their industries and their infrastructure, simply because of the appalling impact that communism had on their country. Of course.
At the beginning of his speech, he referred to the terrible pact between Hitler and Stalin that paved the way for the Second World War. I think he also ought to make some reference to the fact that when the underground army rose up in 1944 and we wished to supply them with airdrops, munitions, the Russians refused to allow our transport aircraft to operate from their bases so as to help support the Poles in that uprising. And whilst I know he is mainly concerned with the Polish contribution to the effort in Britain, we should not also forget those people in Poland who saved the remnants of families like mine from extermination by hiding Jewish people at the risk of their own lives.
Well, I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend, and I have to say to him that when we take regular delegations of British MPs, as the chairman of the All-Party Group for Poland, and by the way, if there's anybody here who hasn't joined the All-Party Group for Poland, you better do so, or I very much hope to invite you to join. I think we now have 62 members of Parliament, making us one of the larger all-party groups. When we take regular delegations to Poland, we actually have seen a memorial in Warsaw where one of those British planes crashed in a park whilst trying to supply food and weapons to the underground fighters in the Warsaw Uprising, who were taking on the Germans in the summer of 1944, whilst the Russians stayed on the other side of the river, allowing the slaughter to take place on an unprecedented scale. So we laid flowers, I'd like him to know, at the monument in the park where the British plane crashed. And of course, he is absolutely right. Stalin refused to allow the British planes flying from Italy, I think Ancona or somewhere on the coast there, all the way to Warsaw. So they had to fly all the way there, drop the equipment and fly back. And I also pay tribute to his reference to the sacrifices of Poles in helping their Jewish friends and neighbours during the Second World War. Members of my family were shot by the Germans for hiding Jews on our estate in Western Poland. And Poland was the only country in occupied Europe where there was the death penalty for helping Jewish people. So people knew exactly what they were doing when they were hiding and protecting Jews. In my family's case, they made my relative watch as they shot his 12-year-old daughter first, then they shot his wife, then they shot him. And his crime was hiding Jewish friends and neighbours. So this is something we will never forget, and we will always pass on to our children and the next generation. And finally, Mr. Pritchard, the alliance with Poland today is very, very strong. We now have 1 million Poles living and working, contributing to our country, and in the post-Brexit world, their rights will be guaranteed to stay in our country, and they will continue to make a vast contribution to our island. And we are not going to put sea mines in the English Channel and barbed wire on the cliffs of Dover. We will continue to welcome highly skilled, highly educated Polish workers to our country with the new immigration work permits that will be afforded. And when we do go to Poland, Mr. Pritchard, we meet with soldiers who are on a rotational basis in northeast Poland. We already have 150 British soldiers in the Suwałki Gap, and I very much hope it's a prelude to a permanent NATO base or maybe even a permanent British base in eastern Poland. The Americans are already talking to their Polish counterparts about an American base in Poland, and I very much hope that we will follow suit. I've received a letter from the British Legion. I'm not sure whether representatives have managed to come here today, but they have sent me a 2-page letter outlining what the British Legion are doing through their campaign Remember Together to engage with the Polish community up and down our country and collectively with their British counterparts remember the tremendous courage and dignity of both British and Polish pilots. As the first ever Polish-born British Member of Parliament, Mr. Pritchard, I take great pride in the contribution of Poles to this country, not only in the Battle of Britain, but subsequently. And I very much hope that we will continue to work with this key strategic European partner in many years to come to forge ever closer, stronger military and economic links. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered the Polish contribution to the UK war effort in World War II. I'm not going to put a formal time limit at the moment. It's still fluid, but 5 minutes would be great from honourable members. Stephen Pound.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Pritchard. It's customary on these occasions to say what a pleasure it is to serve under the chairmanship of whoever happens to be in the chair. In this particular case, sir, it is a real pleasure. You have a true knowledge and understanding and a sympathy for this area and for these points that we're discussing today. I also congratulate the honourable gentleman for Shrewsbury and Atcham. Many a time we have stood opposite each other, divided by politics, but united with our affection, our respect and our admiration for the heroic Poles of yesterday and of today. You may ask, Mr. Pritchard, why is it necessary for us to repeat this litany of heroism again? It's been done before, it may be done again. I would say, Mr. Pritchard, it's essential that we do so. Firstly, because I cannot think of any other example in British history where so small a group of people achieved so much. I wouldn't even quote Churchill on the subject. He was talking of something different. But in all honesty, we owe so much to those few Poles who came here. The second thing is, it's comparatively recently, Mr. Pritchard, that we've actually come to acknowledge and to respect and to understand the contribution that the Poles made. When I was a young man growing up in Hammersmith, I can still remember all my friends who were actually called Małgosia described themselves as Margaret, every Pavel described himself as Paul, and everybody seemed to conceal their Polishness. You didn't understand that they were Polish. Polish history was something we didn't know, we didn't understand. It was only until the Polish millennium in 1966, which actually coincided with the World Cup, when I have to say the Poles did rather support us when we were playing against Germany. But it was only then that the Poles started to emerge as a people. And even then, Mr. Pritchard, we didn't understand about Polish history. Now, I'm from West London, born and bred, and I know the Katyn Memorial, I know the Northolt Polish War Memorial, and I know that there are still people like our excellent ambassador, our Polish ambassador, who will always wear the red and white insignia of 303 Squadron, and I see some people in the gallery wearing that today. The contribution that Polish squadron based at RAF Northolt made has been adumbrated by the honourable gentleman. It really was absolutely extraordinary. I don't think we need to say more, except to say that anyone who knows anything about the conduct of the darkest days of the Second World War will hang their head in shame if they do not acknowledge the heroic contribution, the sacrifice, the blood sacrifice made by those Polish fighter pilots. Happily give way.
Thanks, John. Speaking with his customary force and eloquence, he's right to say that those living in West London might immediately have that understanding. But does he not agree with me? We need to make sure that that acknowledgement is felt throughout our country. In my constituency, I've been pleased to go along to Polish days where I've been at pains to emphasise this. We need a way of ensuring that everyone in our country can fully understand the sacrifice of those brave Polish airmen and women.
Mr. Pritchard, that is it's almost as if I'd asked the honourable gentleman to ask that question. But it's been a long time since I've been in the Whip's office. But I have to say that is precisely the important point, and I'll be coming on to Scotland in a moment, which is a particular part. I'd also like to say we need to say no more about the Polish contribution to the RAF. It has been said before and it must be said again. And the Polish army, the heroism of those who fought with General Anders, who walked, marched, in some cases crawled from Siberia through the whole of Iran to North Africa, to turn the tide in El Alamein and to actually fight, as we've heard, from Tobruk up through Sicily into that impregnable mountain fortress, that Benedictine monastery that could not be broken. Monte Cassino, occupied by a crack division of German paratroopers, in fact, the crack division of German paratroopers, of the Luftwaffe. Those paratroopers held out against one of the biggest combined armies that's ever been assembled. There were regiments, there was a New Zealand regiment made up entirely of Maoris. There were people from North Africa. There were people from France, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and the United States. But there was one group of people who fought their way from hilltop to hilltop, up that precipitous mound, and planted the red and white flag there in the still smoking ruins of Monte Cassino, and with their nobility that actually typifies those people in General Under's army, they then planted the Union flag. I've climbed that hill. I've seen how difficult it must have been. But for me, the memory is not just of the new, beautifully restored Benedictine monastery. It is of the graveyard at the foot of Monte Cassino. You have the Allied graveyard and you have the Polish graveyard. Why? Because there were so many Poles who died, you couldn't incorporate them in the Allied graveyard. And at the base of that graveyard is one grave that stands alone. One grave always covered in flowers, always covered either in red roses or poppies, and we know why the poppies, for the poppies in the snow. That is the grave of General Unders, one of the great heroes. And like the Honourable Gentleman for Shrewsbury and Atcham, I had the honour to meet Senator Unders recently, just to discuss briefly those days. If you look at that graveyard, you'll see that there are three sets of headstones there. There are the Orthodox headstones with a cross. There are also the Star of David, because there were Jewish Poles who fought there, and obviously the Christian cross there. And one of the tragedies, Mr. Pritchard, one of the utter tragedies, is while General Mark Clark was racing towards Rome, where the photographers were waiting for him, General Unders was told by the Supreme Commander of the British forces that there would be no return to Poland. He was told that for all the Poles had done, that was it. Because of the pact with the brutal dictator that we've heard of, there would not be a British-supported return to Poland. General Unders, Mr. Pritchard, could, as a human being, as a hero, could have done what many of us would have done. He would have said, in that case, we're going home. We're throwing down our rifles, we're taking off our packs, and we are leaving. Unders didn't do that. Unders said, we fight on. And fight on they did. I think that typifies the strength and the determination of the Polish people. What I would like to mention, though, is an area that hasn't been touched on in any details, and that is the extraordinary contribution of the Polish naval forces. 1939, the Polish Navy was in quite good condition. It was a modern navy, it has a submarine-based navy, and they managed to escape from Gdansk and from the seaports on the north of Poland to Leith, the port of Edinburgh, where their flagship, the Pirun, which is Polish for thunderer, was in fact laid down in John Brown's shipyard as the HMS Nerissa, and she was then renamed and crewed entirely by Poles. These Polish ships, who then came under the command of the First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, made an incredible contribution in theatres of war from Narvik, Dunkirk, the Lofoten Islands, Tobruk, the Murmansk convoys, where my honourable friend for Dewsbury's grandfather certainly sailed with them, and obviously the Normandy landings. But in two particular areas, the Polish Navy made an incredible contribution that I simply, Mr. Pritchard, beg your indulgence to allow me to mention briefly, if I can, today. The first was that awful night of the 13th of March, 1941, when over 1,000 people in Glasgow were killed. It was called the Clydebank Blitz. And I'd like to pay tribute, if I may, to the Honourable Gentleman, the member for West Dunbartonshire, who introduced a debate on the floor of the House about the Clydebank Blitz. This was when John Brown's shipyard and the Singer factory next to it were being bombed ruthlessly, and virtually the whole of that area of Clydebank, from Hardgate, that whole of that part of Glasgow was destroyed. The opposition to the Luftwaffe was led by the Pirun. She was in harbour, undergoing repairs. She had 6 anti-aircraft guns and some refitted Bofors guns and the old, what we used to call pom-poms. She fought off the second wave of the Luftwaffe. How many lives she saved, I cannot even begin to think, but she did. And isn't it extraordinary to think that Pirun was laid down in the very shipyard that she then defended, having sailed from there to Poland and back again. It's almost as if she was born to defend her birthplace, as many a Pole would say. The second thing, quite clearly, is the extraordinary occurrences of May 1941. In May 1941, the hinge of history was turning. The Germans had massive naval superiority. They had the two best ocean raiders in the world, Bismarck and Tirpitz. They also had the best heavy cruisers, Gneisenau and Scharnhorst. Had they got out into the North Atlantic, our supply routes from Canada and America would have been finished. There would have been no opportunity whatsoever for us to have continued the war at sea. Tirpitz, as we know, was destroyed in the fjords in Norway by the RAF, but Bismarck had earlier in that year, in the Battle of the Denmark Strait, not only destroyed the British task force, but sunk the pride of the Royal Navy, the mighty Hood. And many matelots of my father's generation still say the old Andrew died with the Hood. She was the pride of our Navy. Bismarck sunk her and moved on. Admiral Tovey and Task Force H were immediately sent to the area, off the Norway coast in May under the instructions of Churchill, to sink the Bismarck. Who was there? Who was there at the front of that? It wasn't just Rodney and Repulse, it was Piorun, the Polish destroyer, there, steaming ahead as fast as she could. And it is said that she didn't even wait for embarkation orders. She left. She left Scotland and headed straight for the battlefield. And then, as we know, Bismarck had her steering gear crippled by a fairy swordfish torpedo, and she was slightly reduced in her maneuverability. But she still had powerful, powerful weapons. She had 8 15-inch guns in 4 turrets. Piorun was one of the ships in that task force that received, on the 25th of May, 1941, probably the most significant message received in the sea war, in the last war. And it came from Bletchley. It came from a Polish interpreter, someone who had actually managed to break the codes. And it told precisely what the German admiral was doing. So here we see, even though Piorun was then straddled at 12,000 meters by a complete bombardment from Bismarck, she carried on. And some say she delivered the coup de grace. Some say that she was the last torpedo fired into Bismarck. I just close by saying 2 things. I've touched on betrayal is an ugly word, but I think in some ways the Poles were betrayed at the end of the war. We compensated by the 1947 legislation, but in some ways I think we let the Poles down. I would say, Mr. Pritchard, the Poles never, ever let us down. And I think it's not for me to make an obvious pro-European, pro-EU statement at this, but isn't it wonderful what we can achieve when we fight together in a common cause? And I say, Mr. Pritchard, if ever I have to fight anyone, anywhere, at any time, let it be with our brothers and sisters of the Free Republic of Poland, some of the bravest and most heroic people it has ever, ever been my honour to know. Thank you.
That was lovely.
We were going to be down to 4 minutes. The Minister of State has very kindly given up 5 minutes of the front bench time, so we're back up to 5 minutes. But can we stick to 5 minutes, please? Gillian Keegan.
Thank you, Mr. Pritchard. It is a pleasure to indeed serve under your chairmanship, and I would like to congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Shrewsbury and Atcham, on securing the debate and also his excellent and very moving speech. And of course, it's a great honour to follow the honourable member for Ealing North and his wonderful speech. I wanted to contribute to this debate for 2 reasons. Firstly, because RAF Tangmere in my constituency played such a pivotal role during the Battle of Britain. And secondly, to thank the Polish pilots, many of whom took to the skies to defend our country and fight for theirs. And their efforts in the Second World War were vital and must never be forgotten. RAF Tangmere and West Hampton was the most southerly RAF fighter command base during the Battle of Britain, and they played an historic role in the defence of our country during our darkest hour over the summer of 1940. And many of the few, as they become known, flew from Tangmere, including revered pilots like Douglas Bader and Billy Fisk. The Polish squadrons 302 and 303 didn't fly from Tangmere, but today their contribution has been marked by the Tangmere Military Aviation Museum, which stands on the old site of the old airfield. Last summer, the museum held an exhibition solely focused on the contribution made by Polish and Czech air crews, their pilots and their highly skilled crews who came to the country to fight the Nazis after their homelands had been invaded and occupied. And over 4,000 people visited the exhibition over a 6-week period. And I was very pleased to meet with veterans who had served and several young people from Poland who were keen to research the roles their grandfathers and uncles had played in World War II. I'm very happy to give it.
Giving way, just when she refers to young people attending, would you agree with me that while it is exceptionally important that generations that we would represent here are made aware and reminded of the bravery and sacrifices that were made, that it is even more important that future generations remember that so that mistakes of the past are not repeated?
I completely agree, which makes this debate and the continuation of these memorials and exhibitions and museums and celebration is important for future generations to see always. The Imperial War Museum records that 145 Polish men fought alongside our pilots during this fateful time, and during this period destroyed 204 enemy aircraft, and the people of Britain owe their liberty in part to their heroism. I'm proud that in Chichester we play our part in continuing to remember them. But as many members have mentioned, Poland's contribution to our war effort goes far beyond the Battle of Britain. The Nazi occupation of Poland was one of the most brutal of the war. Poland was carved up with Stalin under the German-Soviet non-aggression pact, and the German-occupied zone became known as the General Government, which was placed under the control of Hitler's lawyer, a ruthless Nazi called Hans Frank, who was later hanged at Nuremberg. Although divided, occupied, brutalised and stripped of their identity, the Poles fought on and continued to resist. 1943 saw the heroic Warsaw Uprising by the Jewish community, and later in 1944 the entire population of Warsaw did the same in a heroic effort to liberate their capital city from the Nazi tyranny.
I'd like to thank the honourable member for recognising the Jewish efforts in the war. There were actually 150,000 Jews serving in the Polish army in September 1939 in that campaign. Many of those went to fight in the Polish Free Army in France and in the United Kingdom. Just as many fought as partisans and in the Warsaw Uprising. My own grandfather, Maximilian Sobel, fought on the German front as part of the Polish army on the Eastern Front and was particularly commanded the Independent Motor Battalion during the Battle of Dresden. So I'd like to put that on record. Thank you.
I'm very glad the honourable member.
Can I just remind honourable members, I've been very flexible. A couple of people have come in late and I've allowed them to have interventions. But coming in pretty much halfway through the debate is pushing the envelope. So can I remind all honourable members, please attend at the beginning of the debate. We all run slightly late, but coming halfway through and expect to speak, I think is, as I say, pushing the envelope, however good the contribution might be. Gillian Keegan.
Thank you. The heroism of these two uprisings by the Polish people are the greatest acts of resistance against tyranny the world has ever seen. And it's an enduring stain on the record of the Soviet Union's wartime history that Stalin ordered his troops encircling Warsaw to do nothing whilst the Nazis put down the uprising and destroyed much of the city. I think it's important in this debate to highlight the cruel fact that the majority of the Nazi death camps were built in Poland. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor and Majdanek were all in Poland, and these camps are believed to be where 3 million people were murdered. Over the course of the war, Poland lost 6 million of its citizens, half of whom were Jewish. We remembered them on International Holocaust Memorial Day this year in Speaker's House, where I was proud that a Chichester choir performed the Holocaust opera Push to members of both Houses of Parliament. There can be no doubt whatsoever that Poland played a huge part in the war effort, both in the UK and in resisting at home. And I want to thank my honourable friend for securing the debate and ensure him that in Chichester we will never forget the bravery of our Polish friends and allies.
Yeah. Well done.
Shannon.
Very good. It's a pleasure to speak in this. Can I first of all thank the honourable gentleman for Shrewsbury and Itchem for setting it together. He did say he was challenged with some Polish words. The area that I come from, We have a strong tradition of service with the Polish during the Second World War. So if you add the Polish language and the Ulster Scots language together, you would really be challenged.
Totally confused.
So I'll try not to do any Polish as an Ulster Scot because it'll all come over the wrong way. Just say this, I'm somewhat of a history buff. It's, my children and my boys would say I'm more of a history geek. But on the years that I'm able to take a holiday, I would read perhaps maybe 8 biographies or history books, and I've recently been enjoying learning more about the Battle of Britain, and during which the Poles truly excelled. So members are, honourable members and right honourable members are referring to memorials across the whole of the United Kingdom. We're the first memorial to be built, was built by Ards and North Down Borough Council with some Crown funding, as well as for your freedom, and ours to celebrate the 100 years of Polish independence and the Royal Air Force and the Polish Air Force centenaries. And a permanent monument has been erected at the Cenotaph in Newton Ards in the middle of my constituency of Strangford, unveiled by the daughters of Polish airmen who were stationed in Ballyhalbert and who met and married local girls and raised their children there. So we've a strong association with Poland, and the constituency that I represent, I'm very privileged to represent. But also, when we look at and that's why the interest in the Air Force, and especially in the Polish Air Force and their contribution is marvellous. The monument is dedicated to the memory of the Polish airmen who lost their lives in the Battle of Britain and other theatres of the Second World War. It's also in remembrance of number 303 and number 315 Polish fighter squadrons that were stationed at the RAF in Ballyhalbert. They were stationed at Ballyhalbert and in Newton Ards, and all members of the Polish forces buried in Northern Ireland. The sacrifice and courage shown by the Polish Air Force during the Second World War was instrumental in our victory. Many have said it, I can say it with all honesty, because I know what has happened and their contribution in my constituency. And indeed, RAF commander at that time, now David Nivens, who performed the ceremony on the day at the unveiling, that the Battle of Britain may well have ended very differently without the practical know-how and the courage of the Polish Air Force station in Ballyhalbert and in Newton Ards. Their contribution was significant and it made a big difference. And as we leave the EU through Brexit, the bonds that bring us together through military service and now NATO will last well beyond that. Other members have said that will not change. The Polish people will always have a soft spot in the hearts of the people of Ards and the people of Strangford. And this memorial, I believe, is a testament to that fact. And I'm very, very pleased that it is in my constituency that it's in. The East End Residents Association ran an 8-week programme funded by the local housing executive and the council with the group for Your Freedom in Ours, which gave an in-depth history of the Polish Air Force in our area, in the Newton Ards area, the Ballyhalbert area, and in Strangford. The group was made up of teenagers to pensioners, and all who were involved thoroughly enjoyed it. From the talks to tours of the areas of significance, this project truly was inspirational and culminated in the event which saw the unveiling of the Polish Air Force Memorial. It really raised awareness of the role played by the Polish Air Force in the battle for Britain, with so many people in the borough of Ards, and I know that my parliamentary aide who enjoyed reading a book on the Polish spy Christine Granville, or Krishna Charbek, that's probably the wrong pronunciation, but that's the way it is written down here, who worked for British intelligence through the war. And this book came through the East End residents, very specifically, an event at which the author of the book, which was touted to become a Hollywood film. History records the part that had been played by the Polish Air Force in the war effort, but it's been tremendous to see that really coming to life in my own local area, and that was a great history coming live again so many years after the Second World War, and that part that the Polish Air pilots played. In late 2018, an official Polish consulate finally opened in Northern Ireland, and it was wonderful to see the ambassador playing such a leading role in the ceremony to unveil the memorial. It was also tremendous to remind people of the strong bond between the Polish people and ourselves. There are some 30,000 Polish people living in Northern Ireland, and excluding the Republic of Ireland, Scotland and England, the Polish community is the largest immigrant community in Northern Ireland, far above others. So we have a really strong relationship. The bonds remain strong, and we have a lot to be thankful for. And that's why I'm very thankful for this motion today, which seeks to recognise the part played by the Polish in our ultimate victory. We owe them so much. Bill Grant.
It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon, Mr Pritchard. And my thanks also to my honourable friend, the member for Shrewsbury and Aitcham, for securing this very, very important debate. Members, the United Kingdom is indeed indebted to the Polish service personnel who fought in various campaigns on the ground, in the air and at sea during World War II. Their assistance proving invaluable to the Allied war effort. Polish Navy vessels and sailors augmented the British fleet. Not only did the Polish service personnel serve proudly alongside the Royal Navy, but also with the Royal Air Force. It is worth noting, members, that 5% of the pilots in the Battle of Britain were indeed Polish, and it is said that they were responsible for at least 12% of the total victories. 303 Polish Fighter Squadron was recognised as the most successful of any Allied squadron, and 4 Polish officers were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Chair, at this point I have to declare a personal interest in the contribution of the Polish people in supporting the British Army. My late uncle, Frederick Kaiser, commonly known as Freddie, was born in Ruda Slaska, Poland, on the German-Poland border, and was to leave his homeland at 17 years of age when war broke out in 1939, and never to see his mother again. Uncle Freddie fought in the Polish army and was injured in the Ardennes forest in Belgium, where he suffered shrapnel wounds to both legs, and he was more fortunate than one of his fellow soldiers who died that day in the bunker that they shared. Uncle Freddie was flown to a Polish army hospital at Invergordon in Scotland, and once recovered, he was based at the Castle Army Camp in Johnson, Renfrewshire in Scotland, which I understand housed an infantry battalion, and this was one of the many camps throughout Scotland where members of the Polish Army were hosted. Major P.R. Reid MBMC, in his Colditz trilogy, acknowledges the assistance of the Polish people and the Polish Red Cross with his research. His accounts of World War II include reference to the collaboration between the British and Polish service personnel. In the final book, Colditz the Full Story, Major Reid records the numbers of various contingents interned in the castle, listing approximately 222 members of the Polish military, and noting a successful escape in 1941 by a Polish serviceman. Although my uncle was not subjected to the rigours of internment in a prisoner of war camp in Germany, it is believed, although he never spoke very much at all about the war and the events of the war, it is believed he may have suffered a similar or perhaps worse fate at an earlier stage in his life, having been held in a Siberian prisoner of war camp, only to be freed when the Russians changed side. Uncle Freddie, while based at Johnson, met and fell in love, so there's a good news story there, with my mother's sister, Margaret. They married in August 1947, and like many Polish service personnel, he chose to stay in the United Kingdom. He entered coal mining, first at Holsworth Pit in Patna, East Ayrshire, Scotland, and then, as many miners did, they moved to Leicestershire in 1964 to continue work at Bagworth Colliery near Colville, simply taking his family for continued work and exchanging the dangers of conflict for the risks of the mining industry. Freddie Kaiser passed away in 1988, but fortunately prior to his passing, managed to visit his former homeland and family over there, and he has one remaining sister, Elfrida, aged 91. And to this day, members, Scotland still has close ties with the Polish community. Our shared history to be found reflected in places of worship or recorded in memorials such as at St Simon's Church in Glasgow, the Polish War Memorial at RAF Club Prestwick, and the recently refurbished Invergordon Polish War Memorial. I trust the UK Government will also continue to remember not only the contributions of those like my uncle who served and survived, but also the countless Polish lives lost that so we may live. Thank you.
John Howell.
Thank you, Mr. Pritchard. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. My honourable friend, the member for Shrewsbury and Atcham, mentioned the attitude of the Attlee government to Stalin. I'm very pleased that last week we did not show that same attitude to the Russians. At the Council of Europe, we stood up with the Poles to try valiantly to prevent the Russians coming back. We may have lost, but it was a fight worth having. And my honourable friend has also mentioned, I think prompted by my intervention, the role that the Poles played in intelligence. And he mentioned the 3 mathematicians, he gave their names, I won't repeat them, who had helped valiantly to crack Enigma and to save the war going on for at least 2 years. And I think this actually illustrates a very important point, and that's the important point that Poland had the largest intelligence service in the Second World War. It covered many, many countries right across Europe and beyond. It was responsible for a number of activities. It was responsible, for example, for guiding the Allied landings in Morocco and Algeria. Just think of that. It was the Polish intelligence force that guided the Allied landings in there. And in 1943, the British intelligence service received over 10,000 messages from Polish intelligence. Over 10,000 messages. That's an enormous number. But more importantly, it was the Polish intelligence who managed to capture a complete V2 rocket and to send the details of it back to the UK for us to analyse and to help to prevent that rocket creating any more devastation than it did. That is a fantastic achievement for any intelligence service. And I do think that we should pay fulsome tribute to it. Just to move on a second, we have spoken about the experience of the pilots. And I don't think that we should forget those Polish fighter pilots who served alongside Bomber Command in order to help them deliver what they were supposed to deliver to Germany. Now, the UK holds the records of many Polish personnel, and it has freely made them available. But these are more than just a symbol of Poland. They are a very virulent symbol of the real sacrifice that was made by Polish people during the Second World War. And if we can do something with them to make them more available, to make them more prominent, then I will happily join in that campaign to make sure that happens.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pritchard, and again a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Can I also congratulate the member for Shrewsbury and Altrincham for securing this debate today. And as the first ever Polish-born member of this Parliament, it's clearly a matter of great personal importance to him to get this debate. And as I've heard him speak so many times before, he always speaks with great passion about his Polish heritage. And yes, I must look into joining the APPG, so we'll take that up as well. But I hope I can complement his and other members' contributions today by providing a Scottish perspective on the Polish contribution to the UK effort during the Second World War. A fact that caught me a little bit by surprise was that most Polish soldiers who were stationed in the United Kingdom during World War II were actually based in Scotland. Initially, around 17,000 Polish troops were sent to Scotland as they set up camp temporarily in Biggar, Crawford, Douglas and Peebles as part of the Scottish borders. And the 1st Polish Army Corps were quickly formed under the command of General Stanislaw Masiek and Mario Kukel, I think the pronunciation might be. They later went on to establish more permanent bases in Fife, Angus and Perthshire, and by 1944 there were around 26,000 Polish soldiers based in Scotland. These men were tasked with defending the stretch of east coast between the Arbroath part of Scotland and Angus and Burnt Island near my constituency in Fife. And they built anti-invasion defences at places like Lossiemouth and Tangmere, locations which were seen as being at risk from invasion from the then German-occupied Norway. These remains of the defences are still visible in Tangmere Forest to this very day. Polish naval forces also worked alongside the Royal Navy throughout the war, strengthening our sea defences immeasurably. And on the day that Germany invaded Poland, the 1st of September 1939, 4 Polish destroyers forming the Polish Destroyer Squadron sailed into the Firth of Forth and were escorted to the port of Leith, as my right honourable friend for Ealing North alluded to earlier. But Polish ships also docked at a number of other Scottish ports, including Port Glasgow, Greenock, Dundee and Rosyth in my constituency. There's a plaque on the Polish monument in Prestwick, Ayrshire, which also commemorates the Polish sailors who died in the Battle of Atlantic. So in terms of the contribution to Scotland, the Polish impact was huge. The RAF squadrons, 304, 309, 307 and 315, were located at airfields in Scotland, operating training units and located near Grangemouth in Stirlingshire, where all the Polish Spitfire pilots were trained between 1941 and 1943, and also were trained at St Andrews.
Edinburgh University supported the Polish soldiers to continue their studies while in Scotland, and as a result, the Polish School of Medicine at the university was born. The faculty operated from 1941 to 1949 and was the only Polish institution of higher education in the world during the war years. So again, a great testament to the continuing effort that was made by Polish soldiers during these war years. For my own constituency, Dunfermline was home to the 7th Brigade cadre, and in the past few years, Defend Fife has organised an event which takes place to commemorate the history of World War II through battle enactments, film, music and dance. In 2017, Defend Dunfermline World War II Festival was themed around the special relationship between the people of Dunfermline and Polish soldiers who helped defend our town during World War II. And just last year, the festival volunteers unearthed confidential maps and plans drawn up by the Allied Polish armies to enforce roadblocks, checkpoints and positions created by Dunfermline's Home Guard. Delivered by the social enterprise Fourth Pilgrim, the festival aims to attract 5,000 people, reflecting the importance placed on the local contribution of the Polish community and the war effort by the people of Dunfermline and Fife. This year, the theme is to be around air raids of the 1st of 4th and the Polish Navy in Rosyth. And I look forward to celebrating the contributions made by Polish soldiers during the war in my hometown with the people of Dunfermline. I'm sure the member would be made very welcome if he wishes to join us in that. There are a few lasting markers that I think have been left across Scotland, but one is that took my interest was the statue of Dovchek, which is a bear, which is now the statue is in Prince Street Gardens. Dovchek was a 230-kilogram Syrian brown bear who became the mascot of the Polish Second Corps. He was made a corporal in order to secure him passage to the British troop ship bound for the Italian campaign. And he was beloved by his human comrades in arms, and Dovchek learned to drink beer, which I think is maybe a thing that Polish soldiers sometimes do, smoke cigarettes and carry artillery shells, a role he performed during the Battle of Monte Cassino. So Dovchek became a local celebrity at his newfound home of Hutton in Berwickshire, but in 1947 he was rehomed in Edinburgh Zoo, where he lived until his death in 1963 and was regularly visited by many Polish veterans. As we know, after the war, the Poles settled in the UK and the Polish Resettlement Act was the first ever mass immigration legislation of Parliament. Offered British citizenships to hundreds and thousands of displaced Polish troops on British soil. And again, a great testament to the number of people who still live in Scotland, with around 99,000 Polish residents still living in Scotland in 2017, according to our national records. The last thing I'd like to say in conclusion is that we are particularly proud of the connection we have with our Polish population, past and present. It's evident that the events and monuments we continue to hold dear to this day, commemorating what the Poles did for us during the war and the way they've become part of the fabric of our society ever since. And I welcome this opportunity to add the celebration of Polish nationals in the UK by speaking in this debate today. We must continue to talk about their legacy and educate generations to come so that their efforts, their contribution is never forgotten.
And a Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Pritchard. Privileged to serve under your stewardship. I thank the Honourable Member for Shrewsbury and Atcham for, again, highlighting this very important issue. And he has done so not just now, but on a number of occasions. And it just shows the depth of importance of this debate to him, and particularly also in personal circumstances, where members of his family and certainly his great-uncle, who was murdered by the then Nazis, killing their daughter and the wife in the grave that he dug himself personally. So I think tribute to him and all the family that have played a role during the Second World War and supporting us. In June 1940, Mr. Pritchard, the Polish government in exile in the UK signed an agreement with the British government to form an independent Polish army, Air Force, Navy in the UK. 5% of the Polish army were involved in the battle, where Polish where Polish were 145 in total, but they were responsible for 12% of the victories, with in the 303 Polish squadron were recognized for the most successful Allied squadron that there was. 29 Polish pilots lost their lives in the Battle of Britain. 4 Polish officers were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. By the end of the war, 19,400 Poles were serving in the RAF and other commands. 2,408 Polish airmen were killed during the war. 300 Polish squadrons serving in the Bomber Command suffered the highest number of deaths any Bomber Command in the Second World War. Of the 4,000 Polish personnel who served in the Polish Navy during the war, 450 lost their lives. And of course, not to mention the Enigma codebreakers, who obviously shortened the war by at least 2 years, and the contribution that was made is hugely recognized and should be continued to be recognized. The Honourable Member for Shrewsbury and Atcham made, again, a very significant, as he always does, a contribution about the role of the 303 Squadron, about the Navy, predominantly about the Alamein battle as well, and the contribution of the soldiers there. He continues this in an interesting issue, in an issue of the heritage and what we not forget the contribution of those airmen, of those soldiers, and of the naval personnel that served during that war. And it's important for us to be reminded of that day and day. My honourable friend from Dewsbury made an intervention on that in relation to celebrating the contribution of the Polish people here. And I think a number of others, including the member for Henley, I believe, also made a similar contribution. And I think that would be fitting in order to try and have a memorial, an everlasting memorial, perhaps, in further recording that. And also in relation to the words that the member for Henley said about the records that have been kept, and perhaps that could be also formed a base in doing that. And I should ask the Minister if he could possibly look at those requests that have been made in doing that. But we must also remember, in Birmingham, there was a huge role paid by the Polish servicemen, particularly the airmen that played a role, and it's been well recognised in the 303 Squadron, in the Spitfires that were there from Erdington, Birmingham, which were built in Erdington, Birmingham, but a lot of them then based themselves and still do in Birmingham. But we sometimes forget all the engineers who serviced a lot of the Spitfires, as the honourable member has already said, that they were hugely skilled people that came across. So also the people who repaired and serviced those Spitfires were hugely important to the service, because the sooner you can get the Spitfire serviced and back up in operation made a lot bigger contribution. And sometimes we forget about those people on the ground who actually worked in the engineering departments and served to push that forward. And that's got to be recognised. My honourable friend from Ealing North, heroic, passionate, as he always is, made a fabulous contribution, and I think every single word that he said is meant, and particularly the words that he said about General Anders, I think needed to be said in the passion and the way that he said that. Very important for us to recognise and remember the sacrifices of the Polish soldiers. And he said about the Orthodox Christians, he said about the Jewish Polish contribution, and also about the general Christian contribution that was made. I think was absolutely phenomenal and deserved to be recognised, and the fantastic contribution that he's made. Of course.
Very grateful to the honourable gentleman, my friend from Birmingham Perry Bar, for giving way. Can I just add one more name to that list? And that is General Sosabowski, who was in command of the 1st Independent Parachute Brigade that fought so gallantly at Arnhem. We keep remembering the contribution of Poles to British victories. This was not a British victory, but no one contributed to it more gallantly than the Poles, the parachutists, and those who came in the gliders in that fateful battle at the Arnhem Bridge.
I thank my honourable friend, my honourable friend, I would say, rather than just the honourable member. I thank him, and that just shows the determination of the Jewish soldiers, the personnel that fought in the war, of the determination to treat the war as their own, as they were defending Poland in itself. And that goes without saying. I think that's been recognised across the whole of the chamber in that respect. And I think that's been the courage of the Polish soldiers, and that has to be still recognised and understood in relation to that. The Honourable Lady for Chichester, again, made a very good contribution in relation to the constituents where she lives. She did talk about the contribution in the Second World War and how important it was for the Jewish, for the Polish community to be fighting within that, and the role that they played. Again, just continues to remind us of the great sacrifices they made. The member for Strangford, my friend, continues to debate, pushes these issues of the sacrifices and the contributions that were made in Northern Ireland by the Navy, particularly around that area, and the work that he did continues to be that. The Honourable Member for Ayr, Carrick and Cumrock says the contribution again of his own family that was made. And again, that's what needs to be recognised. As my honourable friend from Ealing said, a lot of people changed their names after the war in order to integrate. And so perhaps some people felt that was necessary to do that. But I think now re-establishing that, I think, is a time for us to recognise all of that, because it's important, the heritage of those people to recognise through their names, and I think would be a very important thing. The Honourable Member from Henley mentioned the intelligence services in capturing the V2. V2 was, in this day, was a devastating weapon, and to be able to get hold of that particular weapon, to be able to do something with that, I think was actually phenomenal, a phenomenal achievement on behalf of those intelligence services, and bring that back to for us to be able to reverse engineer and see what was going on and see how it could work off. It was, again, another superb achievement by the Polish personnel serving with us in the Second World War. The member from Dunfermline and West 5 continued to make the point about the contribution in Scotland, particularly the Navy, that had made contributions there. And this is it. We ever look across the whole of the United Kingdom, every single area of the United Kingdom has had and known people in their own particular areas where the Polish service people made a contribution, and they were recognized to this day that they're recognized. And I think we should really now start to look at really pushing that forward and doing that. And I think, just in conclusion, in relation to what my honourable friend from Dewsbury and from Henley mentioned about now setting up a memorial, a permanent memorial, but having a real learning within that, having, if the Minister would look at it, having a real learning element to that, where school children can go, where other people can go and understand the heritage of those people who came here and the support they gave us. And whilst we had a lot of other support from the Commonwealth, my own maternal great-grandfather served in Burma during the Second World War, and also other areas that people that came across to help within that is gratefully received. But I think particular contribution made by the Polish people were absolutely welcome. Thank you, Mr. Pritchard.
Mr. Pritchard, can I thank you on behalf of all of us for chairing our debate this afternoon? And can I very genuinely commend my honourable friend, the member for Shrewsbury and Atcham, for once again securing a debate on the vital contribution made by Poland to the Allied victory in the Second World War. I have absolutely no hesitation in paying tribute once again to all those who served so bravely, and I should also like to reflect on the strength of our partnership with Poland today. Polish service personnel served with distinction in World War II on land, sea, and in the air. They fought in some of the most pivotal battles of the war. At Monte Cassino, 75 years ago, it was, as we've heard, the Polish army that broke through Nazi defences and paved the way for US forces to secure Rome. The Poles paid a very heavy price for that victory, with almost 1,000 soldiers killed and 3,000 injured. My right honourable friend, the Minister for Defence, People and Veterans, paid tribute to the fallen in May when he visited the scene of the battle as part of the 75th anniversary commemorations. The Polish Navy also played a significant role, as we've heard in a remarkable speech from the Honourable Member for Ealing North, protecting the Atlantic convoys and supporting the D-Day landings. And last month in Portsmouth, the Prime Minister of Poland joined Her Majesty the Queen and my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, and the leaders of 14 other countries to remember those who took part in the D-Day landings. And who could forget the 16 Polish squadrons who served in the Royal Air Force, making up the largest foreign contingent. Their bravery helped turn the tide of the war at a critical moment. Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, head of RAF Fighter Command at the time, later wrote that had it not been for the Polish squadrons and their unsurpassed gallantry, I hesitate to say that the outcome of the battle would have been the same. And arguably the most famous squadron of them all, 303, was stationed at RAF Northolt. In March last year, when he was Foreign Secretary, my right honourable friend, the member for Uxbridge, visited the Battle of Britain bunker there with his Polish counterpart, Jacek Czaputowicz, to pay their respects. But, Mr. Pritchard, there is also a very special House of Commons link with those Poles who fought in the Battle of Britain. There was only one serving RAF officer in the House of Commons at the time. He was Robert Grant Ferris, squadron leader Robert Grant Ferris, later Deputy Speaker and then Lord Harvington. And Winston Churchill asked him to move the loyal address after the Battle of Britain, then actually in Church House, because our chamber had been bombed. And Harold Nicholson came up to him and said, I've got the perfect poem for you for the speech, but only found it one day after the opening of Parliament. That poem was Thomas Gray's An 18th Century Prophecy, written, as the title suggests, in the 18th century. And it actually forecast not only flight, but some might argue the Battle of Britain. It says, the time will come when thou shalt lift thine eyes to watch a long-drawn battle in the skies, while aged peasants, too amazed for words, stare at the flying fleets of wondrous birds. England, so long mistress of the sea, where wind and waves confess her sovereignty, her ancient triumphs yet on high shall bear and reign the sovereign of the conquered air. Robert Grant Ferris, therefore, always had the best speech he never made as a poem, which he kept in his pocket for the rest of his life. And every time he told the story, he would pay tribute to Polish pilots who fought in the Battle of Britain. So may that poem be a tribute to Polish pilots. And I'm delighted that after 75 years, I've been able to read it into the record of the House of Commons, as the son of an RAF officer as well. I have little time, so I am, with your permission, Mr. Pritchard, going to skip over the many things that I would like to have said about the relationship between the United Kingdom and Poland today, because it is strong. We work on so many levels, but when we do so, we look back 75 years and beyond at the marvellous relationship between our two countries. So in wishing to leave a little bit of time for my honourable friend to say a few more words, should he so wish, can I just say to all Poles, we in this House offer them our appreciation. To the generations of Poles before who fought bravely alongside the UK and our allies to rid Europe of the Nazis, we all offer our deep and enduring gratitude. And to our Polish allies and friends today, I reaffirm our commitment to our vibrant modern partnership.
Daniel Kawczynski to wind up.
Thank you, Mr. Pritchard, and I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend, the Minister, for the words that he's just shared with us, and particularly that very moving poem. What I'd like to say is my thanks to all colleagues who have come today to take part in this very important debate, and of course members of the Polish diaspora who are in the audience today, and some of the many Poles around the United Kingdom who are watching this on television. When we do go to Warsaw on parliamentary delegations, we don't just go to the Polish Parliament and the Polish Senate. We take honourable members to the Warsaw Uprising Museum so that they can see for themselves, through films and photographs, the complete destruction of this city. I think 95% or 96% of Warsaw was destroyed in 1944. Adolf Hitler was so enraged that these Poles, even at the end of the war, were determined to push them out, that he said he wanted Warsaw to be completely expunged from the map of Europe. And Warsaw was absolutely obliterated in 1944. But the Poles, despite the terrible oppression from the communists, rebuilt the city. And today, I have to say, Poland has the fastest growing economy in Europe at 4.6% per annum. They are becoming an economic engine in the Visegrad Group and in Central and Eastern Europe. This is going to be an extremely important partner for us as we pull out of the European Union. We will need whatever our views are on the European Union, and there are very polarising views on the European Union between the Honourable Member for North Ealing and myself. Whatever our views are, when we pull out of the European Union, we will need very strong strategic bilateral partners who are NATO partners, but who are also members of the European Union. And I think Warsaw will be one of the most important interlocutors for us in order to continue engaging with the European Union and working together for the common benefit of our continent. So I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and I'd like to thank you, Mr. Pritchard, my Shropshire neighbour, for your very, as always, professional and kind way in which you've chaired this debate. Thank you.
Thank you. And on that marvellous note, the question is that this House has considered the Polish contribution to the UK war effort in World War II. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.